All right, so you're in Music of BattleTech, big sound on a budget. Let's go over the agenda real quick. I'm basically going to start with the anatomy of the BattleTech score. I'm going to move on into how I built the team and how I hired the orchestras. And that'll move us into budget and planning, and then ways that we increased mileage using these recordings that we had. But first, you might be asking, who am I? It's kind of existential, but my name is John Everest. I'm a freelance composer from Seattle. I mostly work in video games, and I've scored several games, most notably Shadowrun Dragonfall, Shadowrun Hong Kong, Necropolis, and most recently BattleTech, the one we're talking about today. And I'm currently doing the music for V1 Interactive, which will probably be announcing some stuff in the next few months, and then some other unannounced goodness as well. But today, as I said, we're going to mostly focus on BattleTech, and I'm going to dig as deep as I can in 30 minutes on how I record the score, and try to help you with your next gig if you are getting a larger budget to work with larger ensembles. But first, have any of you played BattleTech or know what BattleTech is? All right. So I'm going to play a little bit of the opening cinematic. Mike McCain, the art director, is in the crowd. He's going to get mad at me because I used old art. But this will give you an idea of what BattleTech is. So that's BattleTech. You get the gist. It's kind of Game of Thrones in space, a little medieval with a lot of sci-fi elements, basically giant robots punching each other in the face in space. So let's dig into the anatomy of the soundtrack. First, it was 240 minutes of music. It's about 4 hours of music. 60 minutes of that was recorded with live ensembles. So we had a pretty decent ratio of what was kind of a largely orchestral score. We chose to record most of the score in Europe, spanning from Germany, Hungary, and all the way to Latvia. And of course, back to Seattle, where we did some recordings ourselves. So first, in Germany, that you saw in that opening, we recorded with a 74-piece orchestra in the CPE Bach Chapel in Frankfurt. We recorded the full ensemble in a chapel to give it kind of the lush, romantic sound we were going for things like our main theme, where all the players in the room together kind of have this magic happen where you can kind of be one unit. This was a 2-hour session. We did it in a shared session format. So for those of you that aren't familiar, that's where you can actually split up the day with an orchestra with other composers and save a lot of money doing that. So it's definitely a way to push your budget further. So we got about 20 minutes of total music from that 2-hour session. So here's a dry clip from that session, so you can get an idea of what it sounds like with all the added drums and whatnot that I had on that opening cinematic. So they sound great. Nice cohesive sound in that great chapel. Then the rest, or the majority of the rest of the score, was done in Budapest with a 66-piece orchestra for about a 4-hour session for that full kind of altogether 2D session. And then we also had a 2-hour session beyond that with just 41 strings. We recorded the strings only primarily to use later on for things like interactive stems, but also to overdub existing material we had to create a larger sound with the string sections. We did things like have string players put on their mutes in this second session, split between them to just add a little bit of a different sound. We also did a solo cello there in Budapest, and so these sessions brought us about 40 minutes of additional music. And, should have gone to that earlier, sorry. Here's a little bit of that session. This is just the strings in Budapest. Laying it on pretty thick there. Then they recorded in Latvia with a 24-piece choir, members of the Latvian radio choir, and we primarily use those to overlay existing tracks, add a little bit of variation to already choral arrangements. Here's a quick example of how I use them in a combat cue, and I literally just asked them to kind of grunt over the track, so I'm sure they were happy about that. And then we also, in Seattle, recorded with the very talented vocalist Emily Ridgway. She did overlays and also solo voice work for us. And then, of course, I did some of my own recordings myself. BattleTech is kind of, the whole aesthetic of BattleTech is, it's far in the future, but we have this aging technology. They're using equipment that's just laying around, repurposing it in different ways. So I tried to create, stuff that I just had laying around, create something I called the Frankenstring, which I just bowed, I plucked, I hit with things, and made some interesting noises to add a little bit of that gritty texture to the score. And here's I'll just show a quick video of a track that is primarily the Frankenstring. There's some piano and guitar over it, but the rest of it is actually just this weird box. you get the idea. Yeah, that's me in my sweatpants hitting garbage, turning it into a percussion instrument, pretty much whatever I could find. And then, of course, this was all edited and implemented by me using Wise, was the choice of middleware for us. So that's the gist of the anatomy of the BattleTech score. So let's dig a little bit deeper, basic overview of how to pull this sort of thing off. This is kind of the first big orchestral score for me, so there's a lot of learning on my end. The goal, of course, is to avoid this feeling, showing up and kind of being a little bit unprepared. It's always thrilling to record with orchestra, but it's always scary, I think. You know, it's a lot of things coming together at once. The perception is something like this photo, where composers are kind of this monolithic artist who's doing every little part of every piece along the way. That's really not the case. I mean, this was literally the last take of a session that I had for a demo I was recording, and they forced me up on stage to conduct because I'm not a conductor myself. There's professionals that I rely on to do those sorts of things for me, since I feel like I'm better served back in the engineering room. So it looks like I'm calm and collected, but I'm terrified. I'm terrified, and it's most likely that I have soiled my pants at this point. So that concept that the composer is out here doing everything, it's possible to wear multiple hats, but I think that the reality is more something like this, where that's my head in the middle there. The professional Peter Petchik is conducting over there. You saw him in the string cue that I played before. And I'm basically surrounded by a team of professionals that are helping me bring my ideas to life, really. So what I'm trying to say is it takes a team. Not the A team, but a team. It might kind of feel like delegating is giving up some of your artistic soul, but I think the reality is that's not the case. I think for BattleTech, I really felt like if I gave up parts of it to other people, it would feel less mine. But I think the biggest lesson I learned from that is that collaboration to bring these ideas to life is always a good thing. So I probably should have hired additional composers to help me for such a massive scale for one person, but I chose to suffer for some reason. So it takes a team. What do I mean by that? For those that don't know or have never done this before, like I was in your place several years ago, a team is made up of a bunch of people. Who's on your team? These numbers are by no means gospel. Take them with a huge grain of salt. They can be much cheaper, much more expensive. Depends on so many different things. But the team, needs to be paid for their work, hopefully. Anyone from an orchestrator, score part and prep, printing, which is way more expensive than you think it is. Librarian, conductor, engineer, music editing, mixing, Pro Tools operator, implementation support, MIDI mockup support, remote soloists, obviously, additional composers. It's a lot, but it's necessary. Good thing for you, though, is if building a team sounds daunting, there's actually producing and contracting companies out there that can help build a team for you. And so, team within a team. It's kind of like team inception. Companies like Nashville Music Scoring, down in Nashville, obviously. Dynamedian, who I worked with in BattleTech, work a lot in Eastern Europe and are really great to help you book your sessions and manage the whole thing. They even offer orchestration if you need it. Seattle Music, Bastyr, David Saby over there does amazing work, works on a lot of great scores. And then Hollywood Scoring does a lot of very, very cool contracting work down in LA. And there's many also. So you've got your orchestra figured out. Now you got a budget and plan. I have kind of 3 basic overview tips for budgeting and planning your orchestra session. The one is just to do it early. So when you sign a contract, or you're in the process of signing a contract with a studio, try to build in some R&D time into your agreement. Say you want to really approach the score in the appropriate way, and it takes time to do that. You have to research the proper instrumentation. You've got to build your templates, start building your templates. You've got to gather your bids from several different people, interview subcontractors, decide what composers you want to work with if you're having additional music. I'd love to have one month of R&D time. Sometimes you won't, most times you probably won't get that, but ask for it because you'd be surprised. On top of that, make sure you're setting aside enough funds for yourself and your team. I know we're composers, we love to suffer, but you have to be very realistic about your project duration. So fees associated with recording, fees associated with running your business, taxes, healthcare, savings, all the sample libraries you want to buy, it's important. You're in this for the long haul, right? So building a buffer, once you feel like you've comfortably established what it's going to cost to do this, building in a buffer just helps you plan for those unforeseen circumstances. An example of that is the Latvia choir that we worked with. It was a really important cue. It was one of the last ones in the game, and I really wanted to nail it. We just weren't getting it the way I wanted, so I had to add another hour to the session, and that extra $4,000 comes out of me, right? So it's important to kind of build that in. You can obviously set up a scenario where the studio themselves are paying the contractors directly. That can be preferred depending on how you like to operate, but it also can slow things down too. So just kind of a quick order of basic understanding of how expensive it is to record by ranking. LA is typically the most expensive. London shortly after that, and places like Abbey Road or Air. Nashville is very competitive and top-notch players. There's actually a discount going on right now where if you have a session is above $50,000, you get a 25% discount from the Nashville Department of Commerce. So that makes them very competitive. Seattle, and then Budapest, which is where we chose to record. And then also, Prague is on there too somewhere around, and these all mix around too. Depends on your ensemble, on your engineer, on everything. So keep that in mind. Once you've got all that figured out and you're kind of pushing the edge of that budget, there's a bunch of ways to increase mileage after you've got these recording sessions. So you're always going to be relying on your mock-ups, the quality of your mock-ups to save you when things go wrong, and the quality of the mock-up to extend the perception of how much live recording you have on a soundtrack. So if you have good mock-ups, you're really going to kind of save yourself from making a budget that's small stick out as being small. So here's an example. We ran into a problem in Budapest where it was in the end of the day. We had a kind of low and fanfare-ish moment that needed a specific brass part that was actually that was not right on the paper, and we didn't have time to fix it, and we also didn't have really the correct orchestration to support what I was trying to do. Knowing or hearing the sound that you'll hear in a second, I was like, okay, this is not working. But then I remember my mock-up is actually, it's probably going to save the day on this one. So I was able to go back and add the mock-up underneath, take out as much as I could, and then seamlessly kind of mix those together so that I could pull it off. So here's that. Yikes. I like that one better. Another way good mock-ups and overlays can give you extra mileage is they really allow you to reuse material in interesting ways. And what I mean by that is you're in these recording sessions, you've got tons of material coming at you, you've got multiple mics, multiple takes, all this stuff that you have access to that I would say if you're in a recording session, really try to get your hands on as much of the material as possible because you can reuse it in cool ways. These can be reused by augmenting them. So say you have just an isolated string part that you've got from a mic, and you can put that as the basis for another track and start adding extra digital elements over it. Here is the example of that is actually from the opening cinematic. So the live players themselves playing the cue that I wrote, it was originally going to be a much more delicate piece. I decided to amplify it with digital overlays, and we were able to use it in multiple places because basically there was a version that was kind of more quiet, and then there was a version that was more amped up. So you'll see when I play the video. This is live only. It's basically two different songs. Right. Another way to increase mileage off your existing recordings is to use middleware. So we use Wise, and like I was saying before, you have these stems. You've got just tons of stems and other recording takes that you can use and repurpose. So reusing these recordings is a way of increasing your mileage, and they make this, what is a relatively small budget, go a lot further. An example of that that we did with BattleTech was we had basically a 35-second piece, 35-second stem that was a combined mix of a take that we really didn't use, but I thought, this could be a great basis for something. In the game, there's a moment where you're headed to a waypoint on the map. And I knew we had data from the engine that basically could tell Wise the distance you were from that waypoint. So attaching that to the RTPC, I knew that the closer you got to this waypoint, I could start to fade in extra digital elements that I'd added on this 35-second string and horn stem. That basically allowed me to turn what was a 35-second throwaway thing as kind of the basis for part of the soundtrack that is supposed to be kind of an epic moment of you going to get your ship for the first time. So I'll play that for you here. That's the basic stem there. The SFX are turned down, by the way. The percussion starts to come in a little bit. You can see in Wise, it's just basically RTPCs with stems. Volume curve up top. Synth stems start to kind of add in. So turn a 35-second throwaway stem into something that I could actually use. Another quick tip for increasing mileage with Wise, I use subtracks a lot in Wise. So a subtrack, if you don't know, I'm going through a very basic overview of what a subtrack is, but it's basically a way for Wise to choose which essentially stems to play as a song continues to loop or when a song gets into a one-shot scenario. So for BattleTech, you're on your ship that's called the Argo, and each time you go into a new room, I wanted to change the music ever so slightly. And so that way, the way I was going to do that was we already had a switch for each room that the engine was going to send into Wise. And then each switch that would come into Wise would actually tell the sub-track what stems to play, and it would play, basically changing the music, making what was basically a 2-minute loop into a loop that's always kind of changing and evolving. So I will play that right now too. I've got to hand it to Dr. Burrell. This Margot is So yeah, so a way to take what is a 2-minute track and actually add a lot of variation just by adding subtracks. And some of those subtracks are just, stems from a solo cello recording or stems from our solo or our string sections. And it's a really good way to increase your mileage there. So key takeaway, I would say plan early, build R&D into your contract if you can, gather your bids. Make sure you work with and hire a team you can trust and rely on. It's a creative effort. It takes all people working together. Try to build in a budget buffer for things that go wrong. If the studio's on the line for that budget, then you're fine. Make sure you use mock-ups that are convincing that you could ship as is. And then try to find ways using middleware to reuse recordings in interesting ways. So. That's all I have. Thanks for your time. If you have questions, I can take some questions. Questions?
Hi, thanks.
Yeah.
You seem to have a lot of processing going on, not necessarily in the music, but in the producing of the score. How did you keep track of all the different things that were going on and that were coming from different parts of the world and fit it together into one coherent piece?
Yeah, so I think for me, for this particular project, that's Dynamedian helped a lot with that. So the things that they helped me with was session contracting, booking, and then delivery of editing of the edited live sessions. So I would go in and I would sit there in the sessions and we would actually take notes on what takes that we liked. I had a whole ledger of that myself, but I relied mostly on their session producer, David Christensen, who's amazing, to work with him on getting the best takes possible and then digesting those, over transfer files and tracking documents and stuff like that. So those contractors help a lot. I think doing it yourself is also possible, but I just didn't have the time to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome job, man. So I was curious, what was it like hearing your notes played by real players for the first time? How did that feel?
It was terrifying and exciting, right? Because a lot of times, especially when someone like me who didn't grow up with any live players playing my music, it was exciting, and you're surprised at how things can turn out. Things that you think will be really easy to play can sometimes be a lot more difficult. So it's another reason why to hire a good orchestrator. Or that things you think will be really difficult just turn out amazingly, beautiful, and you're like, wow, like I actually, know what I'm doing a little bit.
How long did you have from start to finish, to produce all of that music?
So I was on the project for about just under 3 years, I think. And so a lot of that initial stuff, you're writing digital versions of the soundtrack, and then setting up the basis for me, because I was doing the implementation myself, setting up the basis for the game and its implementation structure and stuff. So a lot of the groundwork is kind of planning and setting up the Wise project and stuff, and then the recording comes much later in the game. We did record the main theme and some other stuff in Germany about a year and a half into that, so we had some recorded material. And then Budapest was about I think 8 months before or 6 months before launch, so it'd be a good amount of time.
I really love the blend of orchestral and electronic sounds throughout. I was wondering if you had any advice for kind of mixing those two sound qualities and making it sound cohesive and unified.
Yeah, I agree. I think they just go really well together. Especially, I'm not like an analog synth snob or anything like that, but there's something physical about synths, analog synths in particular. I mean, soft synths also. That just blend really well with strings. I don't know what it is. I'm not sure. But I think it's just trusting your ears. And then also, I think on that list too is like if your ears are deceiving you, run it by a mixer and just say, hey, what advice do you have? Or say, I'll pay you for a half an hour of looking through a few of my songs. And we have a mixer for our cinematics, which were a lot of hybrid stuff. And he did a great job. His name's Chris Burgess, and he's also good. He's really into analog synths too, so he knows that sound. But it's just all comes down to trusting your ears. If it sounds good to you, it's probably going to sound good to some other people also. All right, we got time. Thanks, guys.